The aorist is the most basic Greek form of the verb. If you just wanted to say something happened and that was all, you'd use the aorist tense form. So why wouldn't we start there? There's one thing that we do wrong, that seminaries do wrong, that grammars do wrong in terms of teaching of Greek. And it's not every grammar does this. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But there is just one thing which I think we do quite wrong when we come to teach Greek grammar. And that is that we start, simply put, with the present tense verb. When we come to verbs, and I think I'm a firm believer that we should be teaching verbs very early on, because the verbs is the main building block of the Greek sentence, right? So that means we need to be teaching it right up front so that people start to orient their thinking around that. But the problem is, if we're teaching the present tense form first, we're really teaching the tense form with the most variation that can take place within at least the roots. And it makes the student think that perhaps this is normal, that this is the most basic form of a Greek verb, and it's not. And so then you have people going on and talking about the significance of the aorist, which is really the least significant verb form of all the verbs in the Greek, set of verb forms, right? The aorist is the least important, least interesting, and tells you the least about the action that's going on. So why would we then start with the present tense form rather than with the aorist? The aorist, like I mentioned, is the most basic Greek form of the verb. If you just wanted to say something happened and that was all, you'd use the aorist tense form. So why wouldn't we start there? The second reason is that the aorist stem, the stem for the aorist verb, is always the same as the root. And that's not always the same as the present tense form. It is often, but not always. But the aorist always has the root of the verb as its stem. And when we get outside of the aorist form, that's when you tend to find the root either changing or being modified or completely being replaced with a different root word entirely. But the aorist form is really quite regular when we understand it this way. So why do most Greek grammars start with the present tense form rather than the aorist tense form? If the aorist tense form is the default verb, is the same as the root form of the word, why do we start with the present tense at all? Well, there's a number of reasons for this. And in fact, when I was last looking at a beginning Greek grammar and creating a new beginning Greek course inside Biblical Mastery Academy, which was at that point Master New Testament Greek, one of the things I did there is I didn't start by choosing a grammar that started with the aorist. I thought about this. Instead, what I did is I started with a grammar that taught verbs very early, like I think we should, but not with the aorist. So why is it that grammars start with the present tense rather than the aorist? There is actually a reason for it, and here's the reason, several reasons, three reasons why that is. The first reason is that when you look at the present tense form of any given word, it's always going to be exactly the same as the lexical form that we find if we look the word up in a Greek dictionary. So it makes sense in that sense to start with the present tense form first, because the first verb form you're going to be looking at as the present tense form is also the form you're going to want to look up when you go to look up that word in a dictionary. If you learn the aorist tense form first, then you have to know the lexical form at the same time that you learn the aorist form, and then you need to understand enough about that lexical form to actually be able to go look it up and know what you're looking for. And that's not super easy because your secondary endings for the aorist tense form are different to your primary endings for your present tense form. So you can see if you start with aorist tense forms and you get asked to go look up a verb, and you haven't learnt the lexical form for that verb or the present tense form for that verb, well, that's going to be a little bit more challenging. So starting with the present tense form allows a student to then go look up words when they see them, if they see them in the present tense form, because they know what to look for. A second reason why grammars tend to start with the present tense form is, to be fair, it's actually the most simple form to learn because it doesn't have a tense morpheme. Yes, it has a connecting vowel, but it doesn't have a tense morpheme and it doesn't have an augment. So there's one, maybe two less things you need to teach when you teach somebody about a present tense form compared to, say, an aorist tense form, where now you have to explain augments. And so there's just a little bit less to learn about the Greek construction of a verb by starting with the present tense form first. And that just means that the bar to learning about verbs is just a little bit lower if you're learning present tense verbs first. And that also means that you're learning primary verb form endings before you learn secondary verb form endings. And that's really the third reason why learning, and this isn't a big reason, but again, if you learn a present tense form first, you're going to learn the primary endings before you learn the secondary endings. Whereas if you go and learn the aorist tense form first, you learn the secondary endings first. And then you're left wondering, what is a primary ending and why is the secondary ending called the primary, not called the primary ending, given that's the first one we're learning? So a lot of this goes back to the issue that we actually just have a whole pile of conventions that have been built up over a few centuries as we've been learning and teaching Greek and learning Greek in the different ways over the years. There's a bunch of conventions that have built up that have meant that now there's a whole pile of resources designed around learning the present tense first, which are actually probably not the ideal way to do it. Hey, thanks so much for watching this video. If you're getting value from it, could you hit the like button? That really helps this video get found, and we really appreciate your support as well. And while you're at it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the notify bell so that you find out next time we release a video just like this one. So it's possible that we could argue that primary endings should actually be called secondary endings, and secondary endings should actually be called primary endings, and we should learn the aorist tense form first. And then that would mean that the lexical form that we look up should also be an aorist form as well. So why isn't any of that the case? Well, again, it's because we have two aorist forms. Which aorist form are you going to learn first? Are you going to learn the one with the sigma alpha tense formative or just with the alpha tense formative? So then you end up, if you're going to teach aorists first, you actually need, and here's a fourth reason, you actually need to actually teach multiple tense morphemes right up front, or you end up splitting between first and second aorist like most grammars do, and you end up having to learn them in two sections, which again is just morphology, right? But you can see where I'm going here. There's no ideal way to teach Greek verbs. The morphology is complicated, whatever you do. So if you're going to be looking at a present tense verb first, well, fine. The advantages are it's a little bit simpler to learn because you don't have to teach them what an augment is. You don't have to know about, you can teach them the lexical form up front. If you go and teach the aorist first, of course, you don't start to think that the present tense is the regular one. In reality, it's actually the present tense is irregular because it gets all these stem changes and root changes and all those kinds of things that take place. So all of this means that there's something kind of fundamentally broken about teaching Greek, but it's not actually the teaching of Greek that's broken. It's really just that the language is sufficiently complicated that multiple ways of approaching this can be really helpful. Now, having said that though, while most grammars today do actually start with the present tense form, and the grammar that we use inside Biblical Mastery Academy does indeed start with the present tense form first, but it actually, I think, does a little better than that. And there are a couple of grammars that do this now. They teach ame verbs, which is the to be verb, just the present tense stative verb to be in English, if you want an equivalent for it. It teaches that form first, which is actually kind of a unique form in its own right in some ways. And you start with that so you get the idea of subject, verb, object and how that works in English, comparing that to how it works in Greek. And I think that's great. And then from there you can go into either aorist or you can go into the present tense. But you can get the basics of verbs by just working on the ame verb up front. And if I was going to write a grammar today, which I'm not, that would be what I would do. Start with the ame verb, then probably go off into the aorist tense form first, maybe add the present tense form after that, and then the second aorist tense form along the way, sometime after that again. And you've got to teach nouns and all that sort of stuff along the way as well. But there are some grammars today that do actually start with the aorist form. There are two that I want to point out here. The first is Rodney Decker's Reading Koine Greek, which is a very good grammar, very detailed, and it starts with the first aorist form and then it goes off, does a whole bunch of other things, teaching present tense form and perfect tense form, and then it teaches the second aorist. Actually, it teaches the first aorist again and then the second aorist again, following on from that. A second one is Reed, O'Donnell and Porter. This is Stan Porter's Fundamentals of New Testament Greek. This starts with some nouns, then goes into the first aorist, teaches then after that first declension nouns and then second declension nouns. So it's pretty similar to the way I would set it up, although I wouldn't use this particular grammar. So those are the two grammars that teach aorist tense verbs first. Now, again, even though these grammars are very good, particularly Decker, and if you had to choose between those two, Decker would be the better choice. I'm still teaching present tense verbs first, mostly because it's a simpler form for students to learn, and even though the root form changes later on, it's much easier just to explain that later on so that students can get their head around it. And that gives you a wider range of grammars that you can work from as a student as well, because most grammars start with the present tense. Therefore, you're more likely to find grammars that have a similar kind of pedagogy, and you're not having to go back and learn the aorist before you can work on, say, your present tense forms or whatever it is again. So if I was going to create my own Greek grammar, which I have no plans to do anytime soon, how would I go about teaching verbs? And I'm not 100% sure I would do this because I'm still not convinced that teaching aorists first is easier for students than teaching present tense verbs first. But I would probably have a serious look at teaching A-me verbs first. And in teaching A-me verbs, that means we can now talk about nouns. Probably we would start with first declension nouns or second declension nouns, probably second declension nouns. Then we would go into A-me verbs, and that way we can now talk about the nominative and the accusative, and so we can talk about the genitive and dative and all that kind of stuff, and we can put the verb in the middle and we can say, you know, how this all functions. And that would be a great way of just sort of talking about the basic sentence structure in Greek and comparing it to English. It also means then we can talk about stative verbs and stativity. The idea of transitive verbs would come later, of course, but it would give us enough to be able to get our head around basic sentence structure, you know, subject, verb, noun, object, those kinds of things, and even indirect object and genitives and stuff like that. So it gives you enough. And this is how Merkel and Plummer's Beginning with New Testament Greek, which is what we use in our membership, is structured. It starts with A-me verbs, and then it goes on to present tense verbs. But I would be interested in toying with a grammar that went with A-me verbs first, taught the basics of Greek verbs, and then went on to aorist verbs, first aorist verbs following on from that. And then perhaps after that, you could go to second aorist or perhaps into present tense and perfect tense, and then second aorist, one of those options, and then come back to the perfect tense forms after that. But that would be kind of what I would be inclined to do. But again, none of this is written in stone anywhere that this is the best way to write. There are pros and cons of starting with an aorist verb first, then there are pros and cons of starting with a present tense form first instead. Whatever you do, it's going to be challenging for students. One has perhaps a higher learning curve up front. The other one has a little bit of extra stuff to learn later on when you realize that the present tense stem is actually not the default stem, nor is it the normative stem in any sense of the word. So maybe the present tense is actually the better place to start. But what do you think? I'm interested in hearing from you. Whatever you learn, if you learned Greek and you learned using the aorist form and you found that easy, let me know in the comment below. If you think that the present tense form is better, then I'd love to hear from you down below as well. And this is really a kind of a nerdy subject in some way, so if you have no opinion whatsoever, that's totally fine. Just throw in there what grammar you might be inclined to use if you were going to learn Greek, and I look forward to hearing from you there. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Until then, keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery, because after all, it's consistency that's going to get you all the way through to mastery, not how fast you go over the next 2 weeks. Okay, so consistency over the longer term, that's the key. Keep taking consistent steps toward mastery.